The NFL draft is only 2 weeks away. That means it's time for another mock draft. This time, there will be trades. Welcome to the Fantasy First Down YouTube channel. If it's your first time here, make sure you subscribe for a lot more amazing fantasy and NFL draft content. Also, check us out on Twitter at Fantasy First Down with no O, like you can see here, and on Instagram at The Fantasy First Down. You can also check out our website at ffdfantasyfootball.com. Today, we're going to be going through my second mock draft of the process. The NFL draft's only a couple of weeks out. That means we're going to be looking at what's going to be happening or what we expect is going to be happening, what the possible outcomes are as we try to predict the mock draft as much as possible. And we're going to talk about a little bit of the fantasy implications of that as well. So, pick number one, we know exactly what pick number one is going to be. It's going to be Caleb Williams from USC. He's a fantastic prospect. He's going to be the first quarterback off the draft in most of your fantasy drafts as well. I expect that in a Superflex league, he's going to be the first guy off the board as well. There's a little bit of risk here. We know that he's got a personality that can be a little bit questionable for some people, but the talent is undoubted. There's a lot of people that are saying he's going to be a bust. That's really only because the expectations are so high. He's the consensus number one pick. It's not going to be anyone else. Now, you'll also notice, by the way, that up the top, I've got the odds according to DraftKings. They're a little bit off for the very top prospects because they do need to include odds of a lot of extra players, but they at least give you an idea of who the main expected guys that could go at this pick or this team is. Now, after Caleb Williams, that's where things get interesting. We've got a couple of options. It could be Jaden Daniels, it could be Drake May, or it could even be JJ McCarthy. And it's not really clear exactly who we're expecting at this point in time. I think it's probably going to be Daniels, and the bookmakers are shifting towards Daniels a lot more as well. He's more mobile. He's more careful with the ball. I think he's also ready to play straight away, unlike quite a few of the other guys who are going to need a little bit more time to kind of get their arms around the offense and really understand what they're doing. Daniels just feels like he could go in day one and at least perform to a reasonable level. I'm not saying he's going to be a winner straight away, but he's someone you can build your franchise around pretty quickly without having to expect there's going to be a couple of years of growing pains. Now, the issue here is while a lot of the people inside Washington do like Daniels, there's certainly a group that like Drake May, and there's a growing contingent that likes JJ McCarthy as well. So this pick could go any number of different ways. I think Daniels is the most likely, but don't be shocked if it's May or even McCarthy at the second pick. Now, the third pick is going to be the Patriots. A lot of people talking about a possible trade down here. I don't think it makes any sense at all to trade down here. The Patriots have a pretty good defense, but they've got no offense at the moment. They need to have a quarterback to build around, and most of the guys that are available here are fantastic options, but they're going to need a year or two to be ready to really perform in the NFL anyway. For that reason, I think if they take Drake May here, who I think is probably the likely option over JJ McCarthy, that means that they have a year or two to really get him ready for the offense. He is that kind of Josh Allen style guy where he's got that big arm, but he's a little bit erratic with the ball, and he's going to need a year or two to really grow into being an NFL passer. So for that reason, I think it makes sense for them to take him here and take that time rather than waiting another year and maybe having a quarterback who's not ready when the rest of the team is. Now, having said that, if Drake May or JJ McCarthy goes with the second pick, I do think they take Jaden Daniels here. There's a lot of news that suggests that Jaden Daniels is probably the pick for New England if they have the choice. Obviously, they'd rather Caleb Williams, but that's not going to happen. But I think that Jaden Daniels is the guy that they'd prefer if he falls to them at 3. And I think it's possible, but unlikely that that happens. Now, after those two picks have happened, that's where things get really interesting. The number 4 and 5 picks are where we expect that a team will trade up to take whichever quarterback falls. It's probably going to be McCarthy that falls to the 4th quarterback, but it is not impossible that Drake May is the guy that falls if someone else falls in love with McCarthy. The question is, who trades down? We've got the Cardinals at pick 4, and we've got the Chargers at pick 5. I really think it could go either way. If I were the Cardinals, I would stick and pick where I am. I don't understand, if you were the Cardinals, why you would choose to trade out when you can get a fantastic wide receiver with your number 4 pick. Having said that, if they decide they want to get more picks and continue that rebuild and maybe then trade back up again later on to get a wide receiver, I think that makes sense. It's just not what I'd personally do. So for that reason, at number 4, I've got them sticking and picking a wide receiver. Now, when I put this together, I had Marvin Harrison Jr. in here. I think for me, he's the number 1 pick in this draft. He's really polished. He does everything pretty well. He's one of the best prospects we've seen since the AJ Green, since the Calvin Johnsons. I'm not saying he's going to be a Calvin Johnson level player, but I'm saying that's a level of prospect we're talking about here. He's someone that's pretty close to Malik Neighbors as the top wide receiver off the board. The bookmakers have Harrison as being the heavy favorite, but Mike Jurecki is really dialed in with the Cardinals, says the Cardinals prefer Malik Neighbors. So it is possible they stick here and pick Neighbors, or that they trade back and then try to trade back up into the number 5 or 6 spot to try to pick Neighbors there after the quarterback's gone off the board. Excuse me. So I've got Harrison going here at the moment, but it easily could be Neighbors. I also think this is a spot where we could see a trade up for McCarthy. Now, with the 5th pick, there's JJ McCarthy. This is the Vikings trading up with the Chargers. I really do think the Vikings are going to trade up into the 4th or 5th spot. If it's not the Vikings, there's a good chance that either the Broncos or the Raiders do it. I don't think it really makes sense for them to do it, but they're certainly the alternative options for the people that are likely to trade up, assuming that someone does. Now, McCarthy is, for me, a tier below the top 3 passes. I don't think he's that sort of elite talent. I think he's a little bit lower down. I don't know that he fully deserves to go here, but we know that quarterbacks rise during the draft process. And McCarthy's someone that's risen a lot with the coaches specifically. The scouts don't like him a lot, but there's a lot of the coaches saying this is the guy they like. They like his personality. They like his winning mentality. They like the upsides and the intangibles that he's got. So even though his instincts are a little bit meh, I can see him at least being used as a solid game manager. We saw that in that kind of like Alex Smith style of just getting the offense to run. That's what happened in Michigan. They hardly had to use him most of the time. Most of the time, they just ran the ball over and over again and dominated with their defense and offensive line. But when it came to the big games, he was able to step up and perform. That's what the Vikings are going to be hoping for here. They've got a lot of good pass catches, but they'll also need to improve their defense and run game so that McCarthy doesn't have to put up 30-plus points every single game to win. Now, what else could happen here? Well, look, it's not impossible that McCarthy's gone earlier and then a team's going to trade up for May. I don't think that Daniels is going to be the guy that falls. It is possible that neither team trades up, and then it will be interesting to see what the Giants do at 6. Do they take McCarthy? I think probably not, because they're kind of stuck with that Daniel Jones contract. Doesn't make sense to start your rookie contract when you're paying another quarterback a whole lot of money. You can't take advantage of that cheap quarterback. So I think that McCarthy probably goes at 4 or 5. If he doesn't, then that's going to get really interesting. Now, with the 6th pick, Giants, they need a wide receiver. They haven't had a wide receiver for ages. Okay, probably not since Odell Beckham Jr. if we really seen a true number 1 wide receiver in New York. In Malik Neighbors, they get exactly that. Neighbors is extremely fast. He's also strong. He's exactly the guy that they need to build this offense about. He's a little bit more explosive, a little bit more, I guess, special than a Marvin Harrison Jr., who's just really good at everything without having any sort of particular elite traits. Neighbors is extremely fast, but he's also explosive. There's a few things he does that just make you really go, wow. And I can imagine a situation where the Giants would jump at the opportunity to take him at 6 if he makes it to this point. It really wouldn't surprise me if he doesn't make it here. It's also not impossible that teams will be jumping over each other to try to get to this point here. So I can imagine teams offering quite a lot of picks to the Giants. For example, if the Cardinals trade back to 11, it would make sense for them to try to jump back up to 6 to try to get their preferred wide receiver. And in that case, that would give the Giants the opportunity to either have a go at Rome Odunze or alternatively build up on other assets they need, like O-linemen. I do think that Neighbors is probably the pick here. It's certainly likely to be wide receiver, but don't discount the other possibilities either. Now, this is a really good offensive line class. I personally think that Joe Alt's by far the best O-lineman in this class. He's the main guy that's a true left tackle. He's big and tall. He's a little bit stiff, but I do think that he's got the talent to be an elite offensive tackle. He's certainly a top 10 prospect in this class. There's a lot of good offensive linemen, but I think he's the only one of them that really deserves to go in the top 10. The rest just a little bit behind. A lot of them can't play left tackle, which is obviously an issue, or at least would struggle there. Whereas Alt is just built for it. He was so good in his 3 or 4 years at Notre Dame. The question is, where does he go? I think Tennessee makes the most sense, but it wouldn't surprise me at all if the Chargers just stay at 5 and choose to pick him, because they do need to build the O-line. We have heard a lot from Harbaugh about the idea that he needs to build around the O-line and he can worry about the weapons later on. That's kind of what he did at Michigan, so it makes sense he'd want to do the same thing here. If he wanted to do that, Joe Alt would be the guy to build around. If he doesn't take Alt there and he slips past the Giants as well, which I think he would, that means that this would be the perfect landing spot. The Titans have built their identity around having a good O-line. However, they've kind of had a few issues with that in the last year or two, and we saw that with the drop-off in Derrick Henry's production. Now they don't have Henry anymore. They're kind of rebuilding around slightly different things. They've got Will Levis. They need to protect him as well. They need their O-line to be very strong. Joe Alt is the guy to make that happen. If he doesn't go at 5 or 6, this has got to be his floor for me. I can't see him getting past this pick. Now, 8th pick, this is where things get interesting. This feels like a trade back spot for me, but I can't work out exactly who would do it. I think it makes sense if a team trades back to 11 that they might jump up to the 8th spot to try to make sure they can get their wide receiver. So don't be surprised if you see Rome Odunze go here. Assuming the Falcons stay, though, it does certainly make sense that they take a defender. Their edge rush has been terrible for years, and every year I mock them an edge rusher, and every year they mock me by not taking one. This year, they've got to do it. The rest of the team's looking pretty strong. They've drafted strong offensive weapons the last 3 years. They got Kyle Pitts. They got Drake London. They got Bijan Robinson. They don't need more offensive players. I know they could take someone like a Brock Bowers or a Rome Odunze here, and that would make them amazing in offense, but their defense sucks. They need more pressure off the edge, and Dallas Turner is the guy that can do that. Now, he's not a special prospect, but he is clearly the best edge rusher in an edge rush class that really lacks depth. There's not a lot of quality edge rushers in this class, especially because Laiatu Latu has a lot of injury concerns, or more specifically concussion issues and neck issues, that people are concerned will make him fall and make him undraftable in the first round. That makes Dallas Turner and Jared Verse extremely valuable in this draft, because there's no other players who can play that position. So it wouldn't surprise me at all if the Falcons just stay here and pick, wanting to make sure that the Bears don't take Turner off their hands at the 9 pick. Now, if it falls this way, I don't think it makes sense for the Bears to take another wide receiver. They've already got Keenan Allen to pair with DJ Moore. They've got Cole Kmet. They just brought in Gerald Everett. They've got plenty of wide receiver options, and this is a deep wide receiver class. They can easily pick one later on as well. I don't think they desperately need to go and get one. For that reason, I've got them trading down with the Chargers, who you might recall traded from 5 back to 11. They now trade up to the 9 spot to get Rome Odunze. Now, this is one of a couple of ways they could do this. When I originally made this mock, less than a week ago, I hadn't seen anyone mocking it this way, with the Chargers going back then coming up. I've now seen 3 or 4 other people doing this around the place. So it does seem to be an idea that a lot of people have in their heads. But the more I think about it, the more I wonder whether it ends up being the Cardinals who do this instead. We're really just going to have to wait and see what happens. But this is the sort of idea of something that I could imagine happening. The Chargers going back, coming back up and getting that wide receiver who they can pair with Joshua Palmer and with Quentin Johnston. Odunze can be the number 1 guy. He's big, he's strong, he's great with the contested catches. He's basically what Quentin Johnston should have been, but wasn't. Johnston struggled with separation and a whole heap of other issues. He just didn't really perform to the standard expected. This will take a little bit of pressure off him. Now, wouldn't shock me either if the Chargers decide to take a tight end here. I think this is in that Brock Bowers range, and we know they just lost Gerald Everett, so they need to give Justin Herbert some weapons. This is assuming they don't take an O-lineman, of course, and it really depends on how they view the O-line class and how desperate they are to shore up that O-line first before they think about taking a player like this. This does really feel like a Rome Odunze situation, though. If he doesn't go in the 8th or 9th pick, I'd be very shocked. 10th pick, I mean, this makes so much sense. New York Jets, Brock Bowers. I mean, they have no tight ends. It's Jeremy Ruckert. It's Tyler Conklin. I mean, they're not special guys. They're not pass catchers. They're solid blockers. I like Ruckert as a blocker. He'd be a good tight end too behind Bowers, but Bowers is a game-changing weapon. This is the Aaron Rodgers win now window. They need to be giving him players to win with. I think they'd love to get a wide receiver. Maybe Rome Odunze. Wouldn't surprise me if they jump up and trade with the Falcons, for example, or even the Titans to try to make sure they can get Odunze. If they don't do that, I think they'll probably just stick and pick whichever of the two is left. I think that's probably going to be Bowers. Now, it's also not impossible that both Bowers and Odunze are off the board here. If that happens, I think it makes sense for them to go O-lineman. The reason I don't have them going O-lineman here, even though it's a need, is that they just brought in Morgan Moses. They've already got their O-line kind of sorted for next year. That's a short-term option, but their win window is really short as well. They really only have the next year or two to win the Super Bowl. So bringing guys who can help you now rather than guys who are going to need a year or two to develop before they can truly play as a tackle. I think that would be their preferred option, but if they don't go that way, I can see a situation where they might go O-line here as well. Now, the 11th pick is where it gets really interesting because it's probably not going to be the Vikings. The Vikings are going to trade up. We just don't know who's going to end up here. Will it be the Cardinals or Chargers? Will it be whoever they trade up with? We saw the Cardinals do that last year. They traded down with the Texans. They moved from 3 downwards. And then they moved back up to the 6th spot to take Paris Johnson, who they wanted anyway. I can imagine a team doing that. For that reason, this 11 spot could be any number of 5 or 6 different teams. There's not many teams that couldn't be picking at 11 here. Somebody will be trading back into this spot. What happens when they get here? Well, it's interesting because for me, the top 10 guys are off the board. And now you've got a lot of options. You could take an O-line, but that's not really a need for Chicago, who I've got going here. Chicago needs to work on their defense. They need to work on that D-line. For that reason, I think Jared Verse is an option. This is kind of the Jared Verse range. I wouldn't be taking him much earlier than this, but I could certainly see him going in the early teens or somewhere around 11 or 12. He could also fall a little bit lower because there's not much edge rush depth or quality in this class. I feel like that means that Verse rises. I don't like him as much as I like Dallas Turner, but he's a rising prospect in this draft, especially with Latu's injury. That makes someone who's just so solid, has good speed and power moves, someone that's reliable. He can drop into coverage as well. He's just a player that you can plug in and will play every down immediately and do a solid job. For that reason, I like the idea of Verse going here. I think he makes sense for the Bears. Also, don't be surprised if you see someone like a Byron Murphy or something like that go off the board here. I think that makes sense. Now, 12th pick, I've got another trade happening. Now, I'm not sure if this trade really makes sense, but there's not a trade that really jumps out as being the obvious one. I just can't imagine the Broncos sticking at 12 and picking. They've got so few picks. They need to get a lot more draft capital. They're not going to win this year. It's not going to happen. Even if they get a new rookie quarterback, they're not going to immediately win. They need to build up so that in a few years they can make something happen. Jarrett Stidham isn't the answer, and most of the quarterbacks available here aren't going to be win now options either. You're going to need to build a really strong team around them so that you can get some Brock Purdy style play out of them rather than a Patrick Mahomes style play where you don't need to give them a lot of assets in order to win. So for that reason, I have the Broncos trading back. I've got them trading back with the Saints here. The reason they're doing that is that the Saints are trying to jump over the Raiders so that they can get their O-lineman. Now, I don't know they desperately need to do this. The Saints need a left tackle. The Raiders need a right tackle. They're probably going for different guys. There's probably 3 good O-linemen who could go here. It's Fashanu, Fatanu, and Fuanga. Very confusing. They all sound very similar names. But I've got them taking Fashanu because he has the upside to play left tackle. Trevor Penning's been a bust for the Saints. They need to bring in a left tackle option. I think Fashanu is the best guy available now that Joe Old is off the board. It makes sense for them to come up here. Having said that, Charlie Campbell is very dialed in from multifootball.com. He's talked a lot about the fact they're probably not going to get an O-lineman and they could go cornerback, wide receiver, or D-line. That seems really weird to me, and the bookmakers certainly heavily think that it's going to be an O-lineman. I have heard other places it's going to be an O-lineman at all, but I also trust Charlie. So it's not impossible that you will see something that's not O-line here. I don't think it makes sense, but there are other options. Also, don't be totally surprised if you see them take a quarterback somewhere in the first few rounds as well. Derek Carr really is a temporary option. I don't know if they can win with Derek Carr, but I feel like Dennis Allen at the moment is just trying to keep his job for another couple of years. To do that, they're going to need to keep winning, and they're going to need to bring in guys who can win straight away. For that reason, I think left tackle makes the most sense. They're also an outside chance to trade up and get a wide receiver because they just, of course, have Michael Thomas drifting out and they've really only got Chris Olave. 13th pick. I've got the Raiders taking a tackle as well. JC Latham is a guy I really like. He is my second best tackle option, but he doesn't play left tackle. So for that reason, I can't see him going to the Saints, and I can't see teams reaching for him. Having said that, I still think he's the second best tackle on the board. There's some teams that believe that as well. I think he's a perfect fit for the Raiders. He's a right tackle option. They've got Colton Miller at left tackle. He slides in there. He can play straight away, can shift inside if needed, but I don't think he needs to. I think this could be any number of other O-linemen as well, and it wouldn't shock me if they go a cornerback here. This is the sort of range where you should start seeing cornerbacks. Assuming the Falcons pass on one, they've looked at quite a few cornerbacks. Then I feel like this is the sort of region where you might start seeing cornerbacks go off the board, someone like a Terrion Arnold. But I would like to see them take a tackle. Not out of the realm of possibility, they take a Michael Penix here as well. Penix has certainly been rising during this process while Bo Nix has been falling back. I can believe a situation where Penix goes in the first round. I don't know if it really makes sense. We've seen a lot of situations in the last few years where there's a lot of draft buzz of QBs going in the first round and they end up falling to the second round. Who knows what's going to happen here? This is a stronger quarterback class than we've seen the last few years. Maybe teams will recognize that, or alternatively, maybe teams will realize that they've got better options on the board. I don't think it makes sense for the Raiders to take a quarterback anyway. They've already got Gardner Minshew and Aiden O'Connell, but teams do dumb things, and the Raiders are very high on the board of teams that do dumb things in the last few years. So I've got them taking another Alabama O-lineman as if they didn't learn with Alex Leatherwood a while back. Having said that, I actually think Latham's a pretty good prospect. This would be a good pick in my opinion. 14th pick. Were you expecting the Broncos here? Well, they're not here because they've traded down again. I really think the Broncos are going to be trading down as much as they can to try to get more capital. They've got no desperate needs that they should be taking with players here. They don't really need O-linemen. There's a whole lot of O-linemen that are going to go off here. So they're better off just picking up a whole heap more assets and then picking a little bit lower down when the player that they actually want is in a better range. I've got the Bengals moving up because they want to be jumping other teams like the Seahawks, maybe the Jaguars, who would like to be picking an O-lineman here. This is a nice spot for them to jump up to. Wouldn't be surprised if they're the ones that jump up to the 12th spot. There's a lot of O-line options here. I like Talise Fuaga. He's an interesting one in that some people have him in the top 10 and the bookmakers have him as the second favorite to be an O-lineman picked in the top 10. I don't think that really makes sense. He's probably going to need to move inside the guard. He's definitely size limited. Can't imagine him playing left tackle. The Bengals don't desperately need a left tackle, but they do need O-linemen, so this is a good fit for them. I just don't see him going earlier. I think with them having Trent Brown there, Trent Brown plays tackle for now. Fuanga plays on the inside and then eventually moves out to right tackle later on. This will certainly help them protect Joe Burrow, and they desperately need to if they're going to have any chance of winning in the near future. 15th pick, and this is an interesting one. When I put this in a couple of days ago, Quinion Mitchell looked like the heavy favorite to be the first cornerback off the board. We're starting to hear a lot of news now that potentially he's actually dropping with teams because the coaches don't like him as much as the scouts do and as much as the community as a whole does. Mitchell has a lot of upside. He's quick. He's athletic. He's basically a good combination of the other two guys. He's got the speed of Nate Wiggins and the instincts of Terrion Arnold. However, he only played at Toledo. He didn't play against a lot of good opponents. They haven't really seen him play against good NFL quality wide receivers. Whether he can produce at a higher level when required, well, we don't know. And he's also going to be very scheme dependent. It's whether he can stick with that, guys, whether he does have the pace to really go with the top NFL receivers. We don't exactly know. He is quick, but he doesn't have Wiggins style pace. So it's going to be about whether his instincts are good enough to make up for that. I think they probably are, but it wouldn't surprise me if this is Terrion Arnold instead. The Colts, it makes the most sense in the world for them to go with a cornerback. Their cornerbacks have been pretty weak of late. They've got Kenny Moore in the slot, of course. Juju Brents and Dallas Flowers are very meh. They need to replace one of them, try to get the best they can out of Brents. Even though it was a second-round pick, he hasn't been fantastic. He's been fine. I think it makes sense for them to go cornerback here. Wouldn't be surprised if they go wide receiver. This is probably where the Brian Thomas window opens. I think that this is too early for Brian Thomas, but he could go here. And if Brock Bowers starts to fall, it wouldn't surprise me if the Colts jump up to try to take him. They've got a million tight ends and none of them are particularly good. I do think the cornerback is the heavy favorite here, though. Pick 16, I mean, the Seahawks have got to work on the trenches on either side of the board. If they don't go O-line, they've got to go D-line, but I think O-line's the most likely option. I've heard a lot of rumors about them going O-line from a lot of different sources. It's hard to know exactly how much of that is just people joining dots and how much of that is people actually hearing from the Seahawks that they want to go O-line. But this is a guy that you will see mocked to the Seahawks a lot, Troy Fautanu, or Fautanu if you want to be really lazy with his name. Ryan Grubb was his OC in college. In fact, he was his college coach in college, and he's now the Seahawks OC. That means that there's already a connection there. It kind of makes sense to bring those two together. Whether he falls to this point or not, we don't really know. He is going to be one of those guys that's at least in the question around that 10th pick down to that 15th pick of guys who could go there. I feel like he's probably more of a guard prospect, but it wouldn't surprise me if teams try to use him as a right tackle. I think that's what the Seahawks would do here if they were to draft him. Sorry, we're at the halfway marks. My water break. Okay. Pick 17. This is where I've got Arnold going off the board. And I think it makes all the sense in the world for the Jaguars to take a cornerback. There has been talk about them going wide receiver, especially after Calvin Ridley was out the door. They're not really happy with the production they're getting from their wide receivers. But I feel like they need to sort out their defense first. Their secondary is very weak. They need better cornerback play. I think Terrion Arnold can do that. He can play as a nickel corner initially and then slide outside once he's ready. The pace is the real question mark here. Talk about Mitchell and Wiggins having pretty good pace. Arnold doesn't. He's fine, but he doesn't have that same level of explosiveness and athleticism. He's very instinctive, though, and I feel like that he can probably make a lot of plays for the Jaguars. I think that this is a good value pick here. It wouldn't be surprised me if Arnold goes off the board as high as 10 or 11. I feel like that sort of area is where he would be of value. But that really depends on how the other teams see Quinion Mitchell. If Mitchell is someone that they still like and those rumors are incorrect, then Arnold and Mitchell are all of a sudden quite similar in quality, and teams don't need to reach up to make sure they get their guy. If, on the other hand, Arnold is the clear number one prospect with teams, I can imagine teams reaching for him a little bit to make sure they get the number one corner in this class. I think that's going to be very interesting to watch as we get closer to the draft, as to which of these guys is actually the true number one corner. You can also get really good odds on Arnold going as the first corner. I believe he's plus 175 or something like that, whereas I see it as more of a 50-50 situation at the moment. So that's worth looking at if you're into that sort of thing. Number 18, here's the Broncos. They've obviously traded down twice from 12 to 14, then 14 to 18. I could see something like that happening. Where they end up, I don't know. They're going to try to trade down, I would expect. Where they end up, well, that will really depend on what they're able to get out of other teams. I think they probably want to take a quarterback. The problem is they've got no second round pick. So if they're going to take one, I don't think Bo Nix or Michael Penix is going to make it until the third round. Sorry. So unless they're happy with someone like a Spencer Rattler, who they shouldn't be, but they could do that. But I think it's probably more likely they want to try to pick their guy in the first round. Bo Nix makes all the sense in the world. He's the classic Sean Payton style quarterback. He can do what's required. He's got good instincts. He can run a little bit. He's pretty accurate, but not special. He's a good leader. I think the character is the main thing they're going to like here. He's played so many years of college and been consistently good without being special. I feel like Payton can put a group in place and a process in place that's going to work for him. But I do think this would be a reach. I don't think Nix is a true first round quality quarterback. I feel like he might go here simply because quarterbacks tend to rise up, but I would much rather see him go a little bit later on. Also not impossible you see Michael Penix go here. He's been rising during the process. If they don't go either of these guys, they do have a couple of options, but I think that someone like a Byron Murphy makes sense. I think that Murphy probably won't make it this low. Some team's going to take him. It's just really hard to work out which, because there's no teams that desperately need a defensive tackle, but someone at some point is going to have to go, this guy's really good. We just need to take him as the best player available, even though it doesn't fill a true need. In this mock, I've got Byron Murphy going next to the Rams. Now, I would be shocked if he falls to this point, but this would be the perfect fit. They just lost Aaron Donald. They get a replacement. Now, Byron Murphy isn't Aaron Donald, but he is clearly the best interior rusher in the class. His run stopping's pretty solid, but his pressure from the interior is excellent. I love the idea of him going to the Rams and trying to take over that role, alleviating a lot of the pressure that's going to go on their edge guys having lost Aaron Donald. If they're going to go Murphy here, I feel like they have to go for an edge rusher. Maybe Verse is still on the board, or they try to go up and go for Turner if he starts to fall a little bit. Maybe they like Latu enough that they're willing to accept the risk of the injuries that he's had. Any of those things are possibilities. I think this is a bit early for a Chop Robinson, who's probably the other guy that we see as an edge rush going in the first round. I think that Byron Murphy makes the most sense, though. They were not getting enough pressure from the edge out of Michael Hoyt. They got plenty out of Byron Young, which is impressive, but they need to get more rushes. I feel like the interior is the best way to do it here, and maybe get an edge rusher in the second, third, or fourth round. After that, we have the Steelers, and everybody is making this connection here. Jackson Powers-Johnson is a fantastic option for the Steelers at this point. There's a couple of guys they could go here. They could also go Graham Barden. Both are capable of playing center or could shift to guard depending on what the Steelers try to do. Wouldn't totally shock me if they go tackle instead and just shift someone else inside. Someone like an Amarius Mims would be good value here, but I like Jackson Powers-Johnson. I feel like he is a quality player. You don't often see interior linemen going this early, like true interior linemen who can't play tackle, but he's that good. I feel like he's the kind of guy who deserves to go in this range here. The Steelers need to go back to their roots of having a really good O-line. That would make them a lot more reliable, means they will have more success running the ball, and will give Russell Wilson, who needs it, a lot of time to throw, because he holds onto the ball more than any other quarterback. That means they need to make sure their O-line is good enough to give him that time. I don't think it makes any sense for them to take a wide receiver here, but that's really the only other option. They're so good with developing day 2 and day 3 receivers. Why would they take a round 1 receiver when it's not even really great value at this point? Pick 21. There's been a lot of talk about D linemen to the Dolphins, and I kind of get that. They just lost Christian Wilkins, so someone like a Byron Murphy or a Johnny Newton would make sense here. They've been linked to Latu a lot. We know they're not scared of taking injury risk players. I think that would make sense. Latu is very quick, so he fits their sort of attitude towards drafting. But I think O-line makes the most sense. Amarius Mims is a monster. He's got so much upside. lacks some maturity, lacks some cleanness to his play. There's also some injury concerns which are there, but there's so much upside. And I think it makes all the sense in the world to take that upside and do a better job of protecting Tua. They need to keep Tua healthy if they're going to win. We've seen what happens when he's not healthy. They really struggle. But when their O-line is strong, they can look really good. For that reason, taking an O-lineman here makes sense to me, even though it wouldn't surprise me if they go D-line instead. I think Mims is a great quality pick here. It wouldn't surprise me if he goes a whole lot earlier because he's the kind of players that teams really would fall in love with. 22nd pick, this is the Eagles. The Eagles are an interesting one. There's really three clear options they could take. For me, the secondary is the one they need to shore up. It was really poor last year. That's partly just because of how they play, but it was very poor. Having said that, the Eagles typically draft O-linemen and D-linemen, so it wouldn't surprise me if they go that way again. It's just their attitude to drafting. They like to make sure their O-line and D-line are very strong. They've gone D-line a number of years in a row, and I could see them going it again and getting someone like a Latu and just making sure they can keep that quality with someone like a Brandon Graham nearing retirement. Also wouldn't surprise me if they get someone like a Graham Barton or a Jackson Powers-Johnson to replace Jason Kelce. I, though, would much prefer to see them get a cornerback. I think Nate Wiggins is very fast. He is strong in coverage. His tackling's pretty weak, but for the most part, your tackling's going to happen at the D-line with the Eagles because not many teams can run straight through them. That's going to protect him a little bit, but he does need to be a little bit stronger, a little bit more willing with his tackling because his coverage is high level. He deserves to go around this range. I can see him being very good for the Eagles, who've really struggled to get solid, consistent performances out of James Bradbury and Darius Slay, who are great players with familiar names, but they're kind of reaching that tipping point, and I feel like they need to be replaced sooner rather than later if the Eagles are going to go for another Super Bowl tilt, which they should be because they've got a lot of the weapons around them on offense. Now, this 23 spot could be any number of teams. I think it's probably going to end up being the Cardinals or the Chargers because they're going to be the guys that are going to trade back with the Vikings, but I wouldn't be surprised if they then use this pick to trade back up again as well. Regardless, I would be shocked if it stays with the Vikings, who currently own it here. The Vikings are likely to go up and use it to get JJ McCarthy. If they don't, they'll probably just stick and pick, and this would be a reasonable pick for any of those three teams, whether it's the Cardinals, the Chargers, or the Vikings. All of them, they're probably the three teams that can use a defensive tackle, and I feel like this is Johnny Newton range. Very talented player, explosive, not the greatest run stopper, but really good interior rusher. He's strong, he's fast, he's aggressive. Love watching him play. Would be a prospect that deserves to be in the first round. I think he'll fall somewhere in the first round. I don't know exactly where, but this is the sort of range where you'll probably see him regardless of whoever has this pick. Also wouldn't be shocking to see the Chargers take a wide receiver here if they skip one in the first round. They didn't in my mock, but if they'd gone O-line, then it would make sense for them to pick a wide receiver here. That would be, say, a Brian Thomas or an A.D. Mitchell. Could also see them go receiver first and then O-line here. There's no great O-linemen sitting around in this range. They could get a Tyler Guyton or someone like that. Speaking of Tyler Guyton, I've got him going to the Cowboys. The Cowboys are favourites to take an O-lineman. Their O-line used to be their thing. It used to be their strength. It used to be the thing that we all associated with the Cowboys. That is no longer the case. They need a lot more quality and they need a lot more depth, and Guyton gives them both of those things. He can slide in immediately and start playing tackle, but they may use him as guard temporarily just to give him that experience until they feel like he's ready. He's very much a Jerry Jones style guy, pretty immature, needs to grow a little bit, but I could imagine a situation where Jerry Jones falls in love with him, falls in love with the upside, and drafts him for that reason. Not impossible they take a wide receiver here. They really only have CD Lamb and nothing else. I'm not buying the Brandon Cooks idea. So for that reason, could see it and take a Brian Thomas, another type of player. There's a lot of upside that I can imagine Jerry Jones falling in love with. Pick 25. This really could easily be a cornerback. It's cornerback or O-line. Graham Barton kind of makes sense here as an interior O-line player. He can go center or guard. They need to be protecting Jordan Love. I think Barton makes sense there. He gives them some flexibility, very good technique, very consistent. I can imagine him going earlier than this. Some people have him mocked a lot earlier. Others have him mocked all the way out of the first round. Guys that I respect a lot don't believe he's a true first-round player. But I think the teams do, and that's what matters. So for that reason, I'm going in the first round. I have him going to the Packers, but I could imagine a situation where the Packers go cornerback. This is the sort of range where we could see a Kool-Aid McKinstry. I also think that Cooper DeJean makes a lot of sense at this point. We've seen him mocked here a heap of times. I reckon 50% of mocks have Cooper DeJean here. I think I've even mocked it before. After his really impressive showing at his private workout recently, I think it would make sense to have him rising a little bit. And this is the sort of range he could fall into. So that's another possibility here. I feel like O-line makes a little bit more sense. Make sure you're protecting Jordan Love. That's kind of been the crux of their success recently. They need to keep making it happen. Now, the fall finally stops for Laiatu Latu. He could go really anywhere in the draft. He's very much a parabolic player. There's a whole heap of different ranges. He could go inside the top 10. It's not impossible to be the first defender off the board, or he could miss the first round entirely. I'm not a doctor, and I don't know any team doctors for this. So for that reason, it's very hard to get an idea on exactly how teams feel about him, and there haven't been a lot of consistent reports. I've heard little bits and pieces about teams being a little bit scared by him, but how scared they are is the real question mark. He's actually the best edge prospect in this class talent-wise, but he's injury risk. Plus, he hasn't been playing against a lot of high-quality O-linemen, so you'd expect him to dominate when he's playing against slightly weaker tackles and guards. Having said that, I think if teams are willing to look past the injury risk, or they don't believe the injury risk is very high, he could go way higher than this. He's a player that's been linked with Miami, for example. It wouldn't shock me entirely if he ends up off the edge of the top 10 with the Bears or the Falcons, but I've got him going here to the Bucs for the second time in my mock. I just think it makes sense. They need an edge rusher. They need to replace Shaq Barrett. I feel like Latu makes sense. This is another team that could go O-line or could pick up a cornerback like a Cooper DeJean or a Kool-Aid McKinstry. I also put a little bit of money on taking wide receiver because the odds are fantastic on that at the moment. They do need to replace Chris Godwin or Mike Evans at some point in time. Makes sense for them to take a third wide receiver and then build for the future a little bit that way. Now, the Cardinals have another pick. Obviously, can't give you odds on this because they've already picked in the draft. You can't bet on this one. Where they go here will depend on what they do earlier in the draft. Presumably, they take a receiver early on. If they trade down so far, the receiver's not an option. I think it makes sense to take a receiver here. Having said that, if they traded down that far, they probably also have pick number 23. So they're going to be a team that's going to be very busy in the first round. I think their main needs remain wide receiver, cornerback, D-line. Not impossible they go O-line because it's always a useful idea, especially when you've got Colin Murray who needs to be protected a little bit better. But I think it makes sense in this situation to go with a cornerback. Kool-Aid McKinstry is good value here. He has a broken foot, which makes him a little bit scary, but broken feet can be recovered from pretty consistently. They're not a recurring injury. He's unlikely to lose much of his explosiveness. The only concern there really is that he's not noted for his work ethic. And when you're recovering from an injury, it kind of helps to be someone who is willing to put in that hard work to make sure the recovery goes smoothly. I've had a broken foot. I don't know if it's the same as his. And it was a lot of hard work just to even get to the point of walking again, let alone playing professional football. So he is going to have to put in the effort there. We'll see how that ends up going. I love his upside, but he is, for me, definitely in a tier below those top three cornerbacks. Also, wouldn't surprise me here if we see someone like a Johnny Newton go, or one of the other defensive tackle options in this class. Now, Brian Thomas will not make it to pick number 28. There's a very low chance of that happening. Someone will trade up to get him. I have no idea who, and I don't know who they're going to trade with. I think Bills make all the sense in the world. I think there's a very good chance they end up with Brian Thomas. He gives them that number one option. I know there's guys like AD Mitchell here. I don't think Mitchell really makes sense as a number one option there. I feel like it makes more sense to get Thomas, pair him with Khalil Shakir and their tight ends Kincaid and Knox. I feel like that gives Josh Allen a proper offense to work with. Thomas is very risky. He's explosive, but he's got really bad hands. He's a bit of a lazy route runner. I think some work needs to be done on him, but I feel like this is the sort of environment where he can work with Sean McDermott to make that happen. I like this pick here. He kind of replaces both Diggs and Davis in what he's able to do. Wouldn't surprise me if the Bills come away with multiple wide receivers out of this draft. There's really no other clear options. The only question is, where do they pick? Now, it's also possible that someone like the Chiefs or even the 49ers or the Panthers comes up to get a wide receiver, jumps the Bills, and grabs Thomas, depending on how far he falls. 29. Now, the Lions are tough to pick because they're going to go so much based on personality, and it's hard to know exactly what they want. What I do know, however, is that this is a Lions-style player. The problem is he doesn't really feel a need for them. The best comp for him is probably Brian Branch, and he just went to the Lions. Having said that, I do think Cooper DeJean is the kind of guy that can move outside. I think that it is valid for him to play as an outside cornerback. He's explosive. He's got good reads. He's a strong tackler. He's a really hard worker. I feel like this is the best fit for the Lions. The Lions are probably most likely to go cornerback. They could go elsewhere, but I think cornerback makes the most sense. If this guy's off the board, where do they go? I mean, they could go a Kool-Aid McKinstry. Kamari Lassiter's not out of the question. I had them drafting him in my previous mock. I could see that occurring. Also, wouldn't shock me if they go O-line or D-line, simply because that's their general draft policy. This will be a very interesting pick. Speaking of interesting picks, it's really hard to mock for Baltimore because the Ravens just always seem to find quality. Who they're going to pick, well, you just never know. It's whichever player happens to fall. I think O-line makes the most sense, and O-line is the heavy favorite with the bookmakers for what they take. They need to make life easier for Lamar Jackson. If they're going to win a Super Bowl, they need to put him in a position where he can run or throw comfortably without being under constant pressure. I think Jordan Morgan helps them do that. He's a player that is liked by quite a few teams in this range. It wouldn't surprise me at all if he slips to Washington or to even to Carolina in the second round. He could also go to Dallas a little bit earlier, but I think Baltimore makes the most sense here. He can play in the interior of the O-line. He can step out to right tackle if needed in the future, but I prefer him on the interior. He's a big man. He's strong, plays with a bit of angry streak, very, 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 very athletic. I think that with the Ravens coaching, they could develop him into a tackle in the future, which would be fantastic as well. Wouldn't surprise me if someone like a Graham Barton goes here either. That's kind of his range as well. Now, the 49ers are a nightmare to try to mock because they just seem to keep going back to the D-line and O-line, and I feel like that's what's going to happen again this year, even though it's not what I would do if I were them. O-line seems to be the number one pick with them, but I do think that edge kind of makes sense. They had Chase Young in temporarily, but he's gone now. They do like to cycle a lot of edge rushes opposite their number one in Nick Bosa. I forgot his name for a second for some reason. So they just tend to cycle a lot of guys opposite him. I think Chopper Robinson is the kind of guy that can play. I don't love him in on every down. He's an okay run stopper, but he's more of an explosive speed guy on the edge. I don't feel like you want him out there on every down. I don't think he's going to work hard enough to make that happen either way. But he is the sort of luxury pick that you can take in this part of the draft. I can imagine the 49ers doing this. I could imagine them going O-line as well if they feel like there's a play that makes sense in this range. All the real clear first round O-linemen are off the board at this stage. They could go Kingsley Suamataia, but I don't know that he's really a true first-round player. I think he's probably more of a second-round guy. For that reason, I have them taking a D-lineman. This is more so to try to get all the first-round players into the first round rather than because I think this is a really obvious fit. Also, don't discount wide receiver here, especially with Brandon Ayuk and Deebo Samuel possibly out the door. There was a lot of news within the last day or so that Brandon Ayuk has taken 49ers off all his social media and he's on the move. That would make even more sense for them to take a wide receiver here. Speaking of taking wide receivers, Chiefs, who happen to be my team, we all want them to take a wide receiver, but I think they're probably going to go O-line. It just seems to be what they do. Wide receiver makes the most sense. They desperately need a wide receiver, especially with Rashee Rice doing stupid stuff. And the fact that Travis Kelce is likely out the door soon, I don't think it makes any sense for them to keep trying to shore up the O&D line when they so desperately need a wide receiver. I would just be personally taking a wide receiver here. Which one they take? Well, it depends who's available. I don't think Brian Thomas is going to be available. They might go up and get him. I would kind of be surprised if Adonai Mitchell is available as well, but you never know. AD is the kind of player that could fall a little bit, so it wouldn't surprise me if he is available here. Xavier Worthy's another guy that's in the conversation. A lot of people talking about him in the first round. I don't see it personally. He seems to be more of a speed guy. I know teams love speed, but I don't think he has the quality to be what the Chiefs or the Bills need. I think he makes more sense to other teams in that early second round. My personal favorite fit here is Xavier Legette, who I think plays with a lot more strength and appears to play with more size, even though he's actually not that big, than Mitchell, than a Thomas, than guys like that, than a Worthy, for example. So for that reason, I would be taking Legette here. I don't think that's going to happen, but I really do hope they pick him regardless. Cool. And with that, we are done. Thank you for joining me for mock draft number 2. I'll be back within the next week with my third mock draft, and then we'll also be on with a final mock draft a day or two out from the draft. Please make sure you check out our YouTube channel. We'll be putting a lot more stuff on there from now. Make sure you subscribe and like this video. And if you've got any questions, make sure you pop them in the comments as well. In addition, make sure you go to Razzball, check out the articles I've been writing over there. I've been looking more at the fantasy relevance of a lot of these players. Also did a video with Jeff Kazar where we talked a lot about which plays are going to go where and how that's going to impact fantasy. I think that's something that's going to be interesting for a lot of people. Of course, you can follow me on Twitter /X at Fantasy First Down with no O, and you can follow me on Instagram at The Fantasy First Down. Our website is ffdfantasyfootball.com. Thank you for listening. Have a fantastic day.